Hey everybody, I'm Rosalind Dennett, and welcome to Season 4 of REFOKUS. Each episode, I'm joined by incredible guests from all areas of the music industry for real and informative conversations with a focus on folk. Hello and welcome to REFOKUS. Our guests today are Stefan Reed and James McKie from Pressgang Mutiny. Pressgang Mutiny are Toronto's shantymen, dedicated to pushing the boundaries of what sea shanties and work songs can be. Their performances take audiences on a journey through traditional acapella arrangements, thoughtful instrumental accompaniment, and inspired use of sampling and production, all guaranteed to get the crowd singing along. Over the past 10 years, they've performed at festivals across the US, Canada, UK, and Europe. Pressgang Mutiny are currently producing a documentary film exploring the Caribbean roots of sea shanties and will release their third album, Departure, in spring 2025. Hello, James and Stefan. How are you doing?
Hey, doing great. Yeah, thanks for having us. Thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. So I'm wondering if you can take us back to when you very first started getting into performing this type of music or got you into singing shanties.
I'm a second generation Morris dancer. So one of the things that you do when you Morris dance is after a hot day of dancing, you go to the pub and you have a beer, and there's a lot of social singing involved. And shanties growing up were just kind of, for me, lumped into that big canon of songs that you sang when you were around other people because they had good, easy choruses to join in on. So I didn't really think of them as any different from that until I got a little bit further along in my understanding of what they were. And part of that was meeting James and the Pressgang crew at the time.
Yeah, and I guess for myself, I'd heard little sort of snippets of shanties growing up. My dad sort of was into folk music, and I guess he would have sung a couple of those songs to me when I was younger, and they're pretty infectious. They're easy to join in on, as Stefan's saying. Maybe not quite choruses, but a shanty really is a call and answer song. So there's a repetitive line or two that would be repeated in a song. It can sort of get stuck in your head. And as I got a little older, I got to hear a few live performances by some of the really great shanty singers, including Johnny Collins and Jim McKie and Graham Knights. And that kind of had an impact on me. And again, it sort of lay dormant for a while. And it was actually in 2013 when I just joined the Lemon Bucket Orchestra. We were on a long tour with a lot of really warm, bumpy van rides with very little to do. So all of a sudden, out of sort of boredom and necessity, we started singing bits of songs, and these songs started coming back to me. And at the end of that tour, I'd sort of made up my mind that I wanted to start a sea shanty group. And then I guess the genesis of Pressgang Mutiny was a lot of people from Lemon Bucket at the time. And over the years, Stefan and Tim and Rich joined in, and here we are now in 2025, staying true to the tradition, but deviating from it a little bit as well.
How many folks are part of the group now?
Currently 4.
And I know that you're both very talented instrumentalists. Do you incorporate instruments into your live show?
Well, the funny thing is we kind of went out of our way not to for the first 10 years of the band. And this year will be the 12-year anniversary. And maybe we'll let Stefan tell the story, but it would have been last summer of 2023. So we performed at some festivals in France and Brittany. And then Tim and I went over to Ireland for a bit. And then we went out to Poland, where there's a surprisingly large shanty scene. Then we, from there, flew to Whitby in England, in Yorkshire. And Stefan's daughter decided to be born a few months early at that point. And the long and short of it, we were down 1/4 of our band. We were down at least 1/4 of our repertoire, and our voices a few weeks into the tour were starting to get a little hoarse. So out of necessity, we borrowed a guitar from my friend Richard Moss and worked up a few songs which are not strictly speaking shanties. These are nautical songs. These are sort of four-bitters or folksal songs, or just folk songs that reference nautical themes. So sort of as out of necessity, we started incorporating some instrumentation. And then from there, we kind of realized it's a nice angle to have. Traditionally, shanties, as I was saying, is sort of it's a call and answer form. So the shantymen would sing a line and the crew would repeat with a line as they were doing an action, either hauling on a rope or pushing on a capstan bar. And sailors did have songs they sang for, in their leisure time, but shanties would not have been one of those songs. It would have been pretty odd for them to sing a work song when they didn't have to work. So rather than just sort of do songs with accompaniment, which we do a little bit, we've actually kind of sought ways to integrate mostly sort of like drum machine kind of production with the shanties themselves, which are, most of them are very rhythmic songs to begin with. So that's the direction we've been heading into, and it's something you'll be hearing in the upcoming album, Departure.
Great. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that sea shanties had quite a viral moment. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what that moment meant for you, career-wise, did you feel like you were able to, pardon the pun, like kind of ride that wave?
Yeah, I think it was pretty interesting for us because these moments happen, sort of once every 10 to 15 years. There was a moment in the early 2000s when a video game came out that featured a lot of shanties on the soundtrack, and there was a bit of a spike in interest. But, early in the pandemic, when the postman from Scotland, Nathan Evans, blew up on TikTok with his version of Wellerman, which James will tell you is not a shanty. We had a bit of a funny reaction to it because we sort of thought we released our previous album, Across the Western Ocean, in late 2019. And we thought, interesting, this pandemic and people can't sing and record together. We might have the only shanty album that comes out for 2 years. So anyone who's interested in shanties is going to come and find us. And of course, that's not at all how it played out. So, we watched with a lot of interest. It was very bizarre to sort of wake up and be forwarded articles from The Guardian and the New York Times talking all about how shanties are having this big moment. We even did try to get on TikTok for a hot minute. It was a lot of work and we're pretty useless at social media. So that was pretty interesting to try out. But I think, our reaction to it generally was that we were thrilled that the music was getting some exposure. We were thrilled that people were able to find a way to sing together, even if it was different from how we sing together and how we came to it. Shanties really at their core are a technology to bring people from different backgrounds and different places in the world, maybe even speaking different languages, together to kind of connect and, in the original case, to work on something and get something done, but also to bond as a crew. And then to sort of see that play out through modern technology was just really, really interesting. And in retrospect, not that surprising that was one of the musical forms that blew up because they're easy. They are designed to sing along and to connect people. And that's exactly what happened.
Well, yeah, I agree with Stefan's point there. Although, as Stefan did mention, I will point out it is not strictly speaking a sea shanty because it's a verse and a chorus, so it's actually a ballad or a folk song. And I will say I do love folk music. My love of sea shanties comes out of my love of folk music. So it's interesting that in a way it could have been any folk song. It didn't need to be a nautical themed folk song. But Stefan is right that there is something about shanties that part of the design and the application and the function was to get people to work together, to sing as they're working together. So yeah, it's a bit ironic in a way, but perhaps also the lyrics were pretty topical for COVID. It's sort of like that anticipation and that excitement for something to arrive, and things will be better when this thing arrives. So yeah, it was definitely unexpected and interesting. And the format was pretty interesting too, where you could collaborate. It allowed you to collaborate and overdub parts where I don't think any other sort of app at the time was designed that way.
One of the things that it did spur for us, because you asked how did we react, there was a lot at the time, I think, of a sort of misunderstanding of, what's a shanty, what's not, where does this music really come from? There historically have been a lot of misperceptions about what shanties are and what the roots of them are, which is part of why we're doing that documentary film that you mentioned off the top to showcase that, a lot of these roots are Afro-Caribbean, African-American, et cetera, rather than sort of, tied up in the British folk revival of the 60s. But what we set out to do, because we weren't able to sing together and do performances, was we started our own podcast called The Shanty Show to talk to singers from around the world. And using very basic technology, we recorded it all on Zoom and then stitched it together after the fact, kind of managed to get some singing done with those folks. But it was all part of sort of our journey to really understand, where do these songs actually come from? What's the real kind of truth behind it? I don't know that there really ever will be a definitive answer, but for us to understand and to showcase some of the people who've really dedicated a lot of time and energy and research to the topic and to bring that to the forefront was really important. And we've used that as our jumping off point for what we bring into our performances now. And certainly what James was referencing with regards to the new album and the use of the drum machine and production, it's all informed by what was this music at its core and what were the other musical traditions that may have sort of maybe related to it or tied into it. So I think it had a pretty profound effect on what we do. I don't think if you'd asked us in 2020 when things started going viral that we would have expected where it's taken us. But yeah, it certainly set us on an interesting trajectory.
Yeah, and it was interesting too that the whole world was on pause. So when we came up with the idea of the Shanty Show, we kind of wrote a wish list of who could we possibly interview, and we wrote kind of all of our heroes and some other people that sort of came to mind subsequently. And And to our great surprise, everybody said yes, because I guess people didn't have anything better to do than talk to a bunch of knuckleheads in Toronto, So it kind of worked out quite nicely, and all things considered.
That's great. And we'll link to the Shanty Show in the notes. It's still available, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.
Perfect. We'll definitely link to that for folks who want to do a deep dive there. I was wondering if we can kind of explore what you were talking about when you mentioned kind of community music, or the feeling of community you get when you sing with other people. As we are entering into more uncertain times, do you see collective singing and song traditions as again being something that's essential to getting through the tough times?
As I was mentioning, folk music is something that has meant a lot to me since I was about 12 years old or so. Initially through hearing the Chieftains and wanting to play Irish fiddle music, and then getting into Cape Breton music, and eventually playing many thousands of gigs in pubs and all that, and getting into playing guitar and singing. And so the song tradition was always very close to me as well. But I never really experienced that sort of communal singing in a way. And it was it was very interesting timing. Shortly after I joined Lemon Bucket and then Pressgang Mutiny came out of that, one of the guys who was in both bands at the time, John David Williams, and I somehow found out about this thing called Another Bloody Folk Club. It used to be at the Gin Mill, I guess, on Bloor Street. And so we kind of stumbled in there, I guess it was December of 2013. And I was just absolutely blown away with what I walked into. Just this sort of community that was there to listen to music. That's how I met Stefan, actually, indirectly. And that was Stefan's parents' social circle, I guess you could say.
Well, they run that club.
That's it.
I think, at the folk club, at Another Bloody Folk Club, sort of with the Morris dancers, and more socially, I was very lucky to grow up in communities that just sang together. And it's always struck me as a little bit of a tragedy that humans don't sing together more. Like, I think it's the saddest thing in the world when you encounter somebody who says, "Oh, I'm not a good singer. I don't really sing." And, I know there are certain people for whom that is, absolutely true, but that's a very small percentage compared to, it's just people aren't used to singing and they feel vulnerable and exposed when doing that. But there is a magic that happens when you get past that in a room full of people just singing together after a few beers at the top of their lungs, that you just can't match. It does create bonding, and it does create trust and connection. And, you mentioned in your question about sort of uncertain times. And I think one of the things generally that we need to do is look to the people around us and look local and find those points of connection. We run a monthly social sing. It's a shanty sing, previously at the Salter Street Brewery, but we're looking for a new home because that place is closing down. And we get, between 40 to 50 people every month who come just to sing shanties. And we project the lyrics up on a screen, and it's not just us singing. We get people to come and lead songs. And it's just been, I think, really, we were talking about this just the other day, incredibly gratifying to have been a part of watching that build. We have people who are now writing songs and bringing it, because you just sort of see what people get out of this shared experience of just simply singing together, which is anyone can do it. There's no barrier, right? And I think that, again, that shanties have this magic in them because they're not complicated songs. They're easy to, you can listen once or twice to the first couple of verses and you can probably figure it out 9 times out of 10. So yeah, I think that there's a real home for that in just helping people find a safe space and a sense of belonging. And we're pretty focused on making sure that exists wherever we go and at all of our shows.
Yeah, and it's really encouraging to see there's a great group out of Ottawa right now as well, Bytown Sea Shanty Collective. And they do a really great sing at, what's the name of the place now?
Beyond the Pale Brewery.
Yeah, they packed the place. We got to go up there a few months ago when Tom Lewis was in town. We did sort of a triple bill up in Ottawa, and it was just amazing to see everyone singing so energetically. So it's nice. Yeah, it's encouraging to see that.
And, especially going in, as you said, uncertain times, but when the economy is bad, singing is free.
That's right. Yeah.
There you go.
Before you mentioned the Ottawa thing, I was wondering, are you starting to see more of these groups crop up around Canada?
Yeah, I think that the Bytown guys are a really good example. James can probably reference a couple of the groups that we're connected to out east. There's actually another group here in Toronto called the Whaling Guild that started out of an irregular shanty sing that happens out on the Danforth. That's a party. It's a really good time.
So, well, when we got started, I was sort of looking around to try to see who else sings shanties in Canada. And really, as far as I could tell, there was only really the Yarmouth Shantymen in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, who were a great bunch of guys. And before the Mast in St. John, New Brunswick, who were also a great crew as well. And they're a bit older than us. So it was, I feel that when we met them, I guess around 2014 or so, they were really thrilled to see a bunch of younger guys sort of taking to it and getting into that kind of music. So maybe we're not seeing it as much as we might like, but it is nice to see a few different groups popping up. And there's also
like we're becoming the old guys now, though.
We are, yeah. I don't know who wrote this. It was a ridiculous description, but at one point someone had written, "We are Canada's youngest shantymen," which we are not anymore. But yeah, you got the Dreadnoughts as well, who are kind of based out of New York, I guess, but have some ties to BC. They do some cool stuff too. They kind of mix it with, I guess, they're mainly like a punk rock band.
Polka, yeah.
With a polka aspect and a sea shanty facet as well. So yeah, it's kind of cool to see it. And at the same time, going back to what you were asking about the Wellerman, I think it was really cool to see just people more aware of shanties or nautical ballads. And if there's more enthusiasm and more awareness of that and more groups forming, that's fantastic in my books.
Do you think that because it really blew up on TikTok, do you see a bit of like diversification in who is interested in sea shanties?
A little bit, but maybe not quite as much as one might imagine. It's funny, our shanty sing at Salter Street, I feel often we sort of surprise a bunch of people who are minding their own business, just going for a drink with some friends on a Sunday afternoon. So that's nice to see, and it's nice to see some of them come back. But yeah, in terms of a wider audience, I don't know. Stefan, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you that I don't think we've seen anything overly material in our audience or different from what you would see with other folk music audiences. But I can imagine, on social media, there might be a lot more diversity engaging with it. But It does tie to one of the things that I think is important to us is, that there's sort of this stereotype in a way of the shanty singers being overweighty, beardy guys raising pints and singing in pubs. And, to a certain degree, we fit that description. So I'm not casting aspersions, but that's not really where this music came from and what the roots of it are, as far as we can tell. It had multiple different influences, and there's, I think, a little bit of an untold story here about some of the Black origins of the music, the Afro-Caribbean and African-American in particular. So I think, the more that we can help to shine a light on some of that, I think it can create ways for other people to maybe access and find and relate to the music, and that's pretty important for us to do as well.
We've brought up the term shantymen a bunch of times. Are there any gender diverse shanty groups? Do women sing shanties? There's no right or wrong answer to that, but is that open for women to sing them as well, or gender diverse folks?
Absolutely. One of the guests on the show is a singer named Heather Wood, who some of the listeners may know from seminal harmony group, The Young Tradition, out of the UK. And she was one of the first female singers of shanties. There was this, even as late as sort of the early 80s, and maybe even beyond, this sort of unspoken thing that women could join in on the choruses, but they were not allowed to lead a song, which to us just seems absolutely insane today. But Heather and then a group of singers out of New York called the Johnson Girls really became the kind of leading lights of, well, screw that. We're just going to sing these songs. And you've got to look up the Johnson Girls albums. I mean, the way that they sing these songs is just so much raw power and energy. It's awesome. We had them on the show as well. I've known them for years. We had the pleasure of performing with them down at the Mystic Seaport Museum at a big event that they used to have there for sea music. So yeah, I don't think that is remotely considered a barrier anymore. And we're all better off for it because there's been some incredible music produced by all-female groups.
Yeah, and the Johnson Girls, I think they referenced the Liverpool Judies and the Norfolk Broads as well, I think, is another group they mentioned. And we did an interview with them on the Shanty Show. And I think it was, one of them mentioned Helen Crichton, the great Canadian ethnomusicologist, had collected one of the shanties. I think it was Brandio. And it was from a bunch of women loading and unloading cargo. I forget where specifically. But yeah, so even just the notion that these songs, a lot of them came from all male environments, but not exclusively. So as Stefan's saying, there are a lot of sort of different aspects to these stories that have not been explored. And I think generally speaking with folk music, that can be the case where people who are maybe socially or economically disadvantaged doing things for their own entertainment. And it doesn't tend to be thought of as important by academics until the tradition is beginning to disappear. And that's when the documentation comes in. So there's a lot of it goes kind of undocumented and kind of disappears into thin air at times, unfortunately.
What do you think about the notion of group singing or shanty singing as, I'm not going to say a replacement for, but as a like kind of form of therapy, like, or soothing? Is that something that you guys have thought of in terms of, your community and the role that it plays in community?
Yeah, so when I began exploring the shanties, I thought of it in a few different terms. I thought of it as, where does this music come from historically? And following that, where does this music come from sort of geographically and culturally? And I think the last one, which really struck me, is, where does this music come from emotionally? And, a lot of these songs, there'll be references to being away from loved ones, or the danger that you're about to face as you're rounding Cape Horn. And there's, to me, especially in the songs, which are kind of less in a steady meter, they tend to be a bit slower, and some of them have a really strong emotional quality. And when I'm singing some of those songs, it does feel kind of therapeutic. It's hard to put into words. You can start to kind of imagine that sentiment and how these people might have been feeling while they're singing it. So I've certainly felt that at times.
Build on it with the personal angle of it, which is, oftentimes, I'll give the example of our monthly sing. Wake up and I'm just like, I do not feel like going. But you force yourself to go, and it turns your day around. And there's just something about singing together when I'm on the stage with these guys, or if the crowd is going, and it has a way of kind of settling you down, making you very present. You're not ruminating on anything else that's going on. You're connected. You've got a sense of belonging. You've got a sense of kind of shared purpose. It might be too bold a word, but something that we're just collaborating on and doing together. And I think, all of those things, you're out of the house, you're being social, and you're connecting and finding a sense of belonging. It has to be a boost to people's mental health.
So then we've talked about the rolling wave of popularity that I'm going to back up and just say kind of traditional music in general can have in our popular culture. And certainly there was like the Irish wave in the 90s, and then we had our Oh Brother Where Art Thou. Now everybody has a banjo time. As people working in the music industry, how much does that affect you in terms of like your careers? And like, do you feel those surges and try to capitalize on them? Do you kind of try to remain steady throughout?
Good question. I guess I would start out by saying that I feel that I've really gone out of my way to devote myself to unpopular and obscure styles of music, generally speaking. That said, I did, when I got into fiddle music, was totally that time period that you're talking about with, the Chieftains. I remember the Long Black Veil, they recorded with, everyone from Sting to Mick Jagger and Tom Jones and all kinds of people. And that came out right around when Riverdance came out, and that came out right around when Ashley McIsaac's Hi, How Are You Today album was becoming a number one hit in Canada. And then shortly after, I guess, as a fiddle player, I found myself playing bluegrass, which was more popular. So I guess I was affected by both of those sort of trends as well. I don't know that I've ever kind of gone out of my way to be affiliated with those things, but I think as a folk musician, certain things do become sort of more popular at times, which I think is kind of good for everyone in the folk scene.
James is a massive Rick Rubin proponent, the producer Rick Rubin, and basically his whole thing is you create to just put it out there, and you're not sort of reacting to what the world is expecting from you. And I think that's the approach that we've taken. It's why we're taking such a big pivot now away from, our first two albums were very traditional, very acapella. And we're just like, there's something cooler, more interesting, and, that we want to explore. And it may alienate a bunch of our current audience. They may love it. It may attract a whole bunch of new people, but we've just got to make this and push it out into the world. And I think that outlook gives us the ability to sort of, weather some of the peaks and valleys. All of that said, if there is a wave that we can kind of catch and surf for a bit, why not? But we're going to do it in a way that feels right to us. I mean, it would have been very easy, I think, for us to have stayed on the TikTok thing, and we'd probably be a lot more popular than we are now, but it didn't feel right. It didn't feel authentic to sort of who we are and what we want to do. So yeah, I don't want to build on what James was saying, to just sort of say, we're just doing our own thing. Yeah. And I've often thought too, with any tradition, any style of music, when someone's starting out with it, you really try to emulate as well as you can. Because I often think of it kind of like a language, and you're learning not just the words individually, but you're learning how to sort of string them together and create sentences. And then you're understanding the nuances of those phrases, and you're understanding the different ways to articulate those phrases. And I think there comes a time where once you feel you've mastered a tradition to a degree, then it's important to start to sort of have your own voice in that style, and to add something to it, to sort of give something back to it. So
in a way, I think, yeah, we were very puritanical for the first 10 years or so and really trying to do shanties the way that they would have been done as best as we could tell. And I would definitely rolled my eyes a number of times when we'd get requests for Barrett's Privateers at the end of a gig and that kind of thing, because it's not technically a shanty and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I think at this point, we've got that reputation of being a credible shanty group that's been around for a while now. And yeah, we're having a bit of fun kind of pushing those boundaries a bit now and making different connections and yeah, just having fun with different styles of music that we enjoy as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting conversation that we could get into, just about like tradition bearers and tradition keepers. And kind of as you mentioned, like at first it can be really constricting until you decide that it's not. And, it's at the end of the day, I think, as someone who also personally loves trad music and loves performing or just playing trad music, did a similar kind of 180 of embracing the things that it can become, in hopes that then, it draws people into the tradition.
Well, I think, it's a fine line, because I think if a practitioner of a tradition hasn't quite figured it out and then they're creating something, then, it could be argued, is this really authentic to the tradition or does it not quite resonate properly? And I think, come to think, you almost need the two different camps. You need the people who want to preserve it the way it was, the historians of the music. I think that's wonderful. I think it's really cool to take a deep dive with someone that can play you exactly how this person played. That's cool. There's a place for that. And I think that also you look at something like bluegrass music, and bluegrass is not really a traditional music. That was Bill Monroe taking aspects he liked of old time music and taking the form of jazz and the concept of improvising and putting different instruments together. And then that became something that was rooted in tradition, that became wildly popular. And now people play it the way Bill played, or they'll deviate from that. So I think, yeah, it's kind of interesting. If nothing gets pushed forward, if the bouzouki or the acoustic guitar never got brought into Irish music, it would still be cool, but it would be lacking something that has become part of the tradition now.
One of the things that always gives us a bit of a chuckle, I think, is that a lot of the times people who are sort of hardliners on what is traditional and what is not are often wrong. I had a really nice moment the other day. My dad, who runs the folk club, tends to veer on the side of traditional, right? And if it's not traditional, I'm not interested. I think we're opening his eyes a little bit, but he sings a version of a song and we recorded a version on our album. And for ours, we went back to the Library of Congress and an Alan Lomax recording and the original recording of this song from 1935. And we based our version off of that. And I got to tell my dad that for years he's been singing the Harry Belafonte version.
Amazing. Yeah, it's a really interesting mix between like responsibility and creativity. Do you find that?
Yeah, for sure. But I think, at its core, all those great folk songs that we like was someone making something up. So people, maybe myself included, maybe we lose track of that sometimes out of our love for that music that's been handed down to us. But that's a fine line. And yeah, I think it always needs something to keep it kind of relevant, to keep it, interesting to people that are hearing it for the first time. So
I think that's what's fun about shanties as an art form is they do have a little bit of a template, as James mentioned, that classic call and response. But these were songs that would have been sung on a ship and you never knew how long the job was going to be. And so the shanty person who's leading the song, the shantymen typically would have to improvise. And so they would be singing about what's going on shore, talking about the owner, making fun of each other, making fun of the captain, etc. So these are like defining characteristics of what a shanty is. But within that template, there's a ton of room to experiment and play around. And so, back to James's point about, and your point, right? You've got to hold the tradition, but really get clear on what you believe is core to that tradition and then create within that framework. And I think that's the balance that we're always trying to strike.
And I'm wondering if you can, I know we've dropped a couple hints about some of the stuff, but let me know and our listeners know about the projects that you guys have coming up. Tell us about Departure.
Sure. So I guess we decided we should go into the studio and record some material. And we were throwing around a few different ideas. I think we're good at beginning things and them not totally materializing for a little while. So some of the songs we had, which we still haven't gotten around to, are songs we did on the Shanty Show. So we did all these interviews and we got all our guests to lead a song or two. And then I think Stefan was saying earlier, we'd kind of mute our Zoom calls, record on separate devices. People would email me those tracks and I kind of put them together. So we've got a really cool half album that has not progressed at all with loads of those songs. So that was one concept for the album. Another concept was sort of just the shanties we like singing nowadays. Another concept was shanty remixes, for lack of a better term, that I've been doing with my drum machine for the last 10 years, just kind of for fun. And we had different ideas about how to go about these different projects. And at one point we kind of thought, well, why don't we just do sort of a mishmash and show people what we're up to nowadays? So we went into the studio with that in mind. And as it turns out, we decided to kind of go down the route of the stuff with the production and the samples, and which means we have even more material that will not make it for this album, but we have sort of in the can right now. So I think currently we're sitting at about 22 tracks for Departure, and it spans a pretty wide range. We do have one entirely a cappella song. We've got one song that features concertina and fiddle. Everything else is kind of a mishmash, to be honest. There's, again, a lot of sampled material from old field recordings or old folk recordings mixed in with different elements. There's some electric guitar on the album played by myself, some by Carl Harvey, who's an incredible guitar player who played with the legendary Toots and the Maytals. We've got Sunray Grennan, son of Winston Grennan, who's himself a great reggae singer and drummer. We've got Terry Wilkins on electric bass, James McElhaney on upright bass.
You got the brass section from Lemon Bucket, or at least a part of it?
Yeah, some Nate Del Vandenberg on trombone and Max Forster on trumpet.
We have the great shanty singer and songwriter Tom Lewis, guest lead vocals.
Yeah, so we got some piano in there. We got all kinds of sort of elements that are just a bit of a mishmash. So
a bit of a departure, if you will.
There you go.
Indeed, yeah.
Oh, that's really exciting, and we'll definitely look out for that. How can folks connect with you online?
Yeah, our website is pressgangmutiny.com. We're at Pressgang Mutiny on most social media. Because of the bizarreness of YouTube, we have 2 YouTube channels, one which has our music, one which has videos of performances and episodes of The Shanty Show. You should subscribe to both.
Absolutely, and we'll link to that in our show notes. James and Stefan, thank you so much for being with us and chatting with us today, and I hope to see and maybe sing a song with you sometime in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
That's all for this episode, friends. The Refocus podcast is an original production by Folk Canada. Find out more by heading to folkcanada.com/refocus. That's REFOLKUS. The podcast is produced by Kayla Nizon and Rosalind Dennett and mixed by Jordan Moore at the Pod Cabin. The opening theme is written and performed by King Cardiac, and the artwork is by Jamie Karn. Please give us a download, subscribe, rate, and review to let us know you care, and follow us at folk_Canada on Instagram to submit your questions.